This is not about alliances or shared values or diplomatic partnership. This is about dependency, the kind that nations spend centuries trying to avoid, the kind that determines who negotiates from strength and who negotiates from need. And the remarkable fact that most people still do not understand is that this dependency has already locked in. The arrangements are already in place. The infrastructure is already built. The alternatives have already been exhausted. I want to be very clear about what I mean when I use the word dependency in this context. I'm not talking about trade relationships that can be renegotiated. I'm not talking about supply agreements that expire and get renewed under different terms. I'm not talking about the normal economic interdependence that characterizes relations between neighboring countries. I'm talking about a structural condition where one nation controls access to something that another nation cannot function without, where substitutes do not exist at scale, where alternatives would take decades to develop and cost more than most economies can afford to spend. This is the position Canada now occupies, not through military conquest, not through financial manipulation, not through diplomatic maneuvering, through geology and geography and the patient construction of processing infrastructure that took 20 years to build while everyone else was looking elsewhere. What most people think they're watching is a trade relationship. Canadians sell resources, Americans buy them, prices fluctuate, contracts get signed, both sides benefit from exchange. This is the comfortable framework that explains North American economic integration for the past 70 years. It is also the framework that stopped describing reality sometime in the early 2020s without anyone announcing that the rules had changed. The substance that Canada controls is not oil. It is not natural gas. It is not wheat or timber or any of the traditional commodities that defined Canadian exports for generations. Those resources matter. Those resources generate revenue and employment and economic activity. But those resources have alternatives. If Canadian oil becomes too expensive, refineries retool for different crude grades. If Canadian lumber faces tariffs, builders source from Europe or South America. If Canadian wheat gets priced out of markets, importers turn to Australia or Argentina. The materials I am describing have no alternatives at scale. They cannot be synthesized economically. They cannot be substituted with different inputs. They exist in meaningful concentrations in very few places on Earth. And the processing infrastructure required to transform raw ore into usable industrial inputs exists in even fewer places. Canada has spent 2 decades building this infrastructure while the United States was fighting wars in the Middle East and China was buying processing capacity in Africa, and Australia was shipping raw materials to Chinese refineries. I need you to understand the specific nature of what these materials enable before we discuss leverage or dependency or strategic advantage. These are not luxury goods. These are not consumer products. These are not commodities that make economies slightly more efficient if available and slightly less efficient if scarce. These are inputs without which advanced industrial economies cannot manufacture the products that define modern technological civilization. Electric vehicle batteries cannot be produced without lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite in specific chemical configurations. The permanent magnets that enable electric motors and wind turbines cannot be manufactured without rare earth elements, particularly neodymium and dysprosium. The semiconductors that control everything from smartphones to fighter jets require dozens of specialty materials, including gallium, germanium, and multiple rare earth elements. The advanced alloys used in aerospace, defense systems, and renewable energy infrastructure depend on materials like vanadium, niobium, and specific grades of titanium. Every one of these material categories is either mined in Canada or processed in Canadian facilities, or both. Some of these materials exist in larger quantities in other countries. China has substantial rare earth deposits. Australia has enormous lithium reserves. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces more cobalt than any other nation. But having ore in the ground is not the same as controlling supply chains. What matters is processing capacity, refining infrastructure, and the technical expertise to transform raw materials into the specific chemical compounds that manufacturers actually need. This is where Canada's position becomes genuinely unprecedented. The country has spent 20 years building integrated supply chains that control minerals from extraction through final processing. Not just mines, not just refineries, not just fabrication facilities. All three, connected by infrastructure that cannot be replicated quickly or cheaply by competitors. Let me give you specific examples, so this is not abstract. The lithium hydroxide production facility in Quebec that came online in 2023 can process raw lithium ore into battery-grade lithium hydroxide, the specific chemical compound that battery manufacturers require. This facility did not just eliminate the need to ship raw lithium to China for processing. It eliminated the technical dependency on Chinese processing expertise. Canadian metallurgists now understand the chemistry as well as anyone in the world. The rare earth processing facility in Saskatchewan that began operations in 2024 can separate mixed rare earth concentrates into individual elements and process those elements into the metal alloys and chemical compounds that industrial users require. This facility broke China's monopoly on heavy, rare earth processing, the category that includes dysprosium and terbium, which are essential for high-performance magnets in military applications and renewable energy systems. The nickel refining complex in northern Ontario that underwent massive expansion between 2020 and 2024 can process multiple grades of nickel ore and produce battery-grade nickel sulfate, the form required for lithium-ion battery production. This complex does not just serve Canadian battery manufacturers. It has become the primary source of battery-grade nickel for American, European, and Asian battery producers who can no longer rely on nickel supplies processed in Russia due to sanctions or processed in Indonesia due to environmental concerns. These facilities represent more than industrial capacity. They represent technical knowledge that took years to develop and cannot be easily transferred. The metallurgists and chemical engineers who operate these facilities understand the specific chemistry of Canadian ore bodies and have optimized processing techniques for these specific materials. Competitors cannot simply build identical facilities in other countries and achieve the same results because the ore chemistry is different and the processing parameters must be adapted to local conditions. This creates a knowledge monopoly that reinforces the resource monopoly. Even if other countries discovered comparable mineral deposits tomorrow, they would need Canadian expertise to efficiently process those materials. Even if other countries built competing facilities, they would face a decade-long learning curve, trying to match Canadian efficiency and output quality. Now let me describe what this means in terms of dependency. The United States requires these materials to manufacture everything from electric vehicles to fighter jets. American manufacturers cannot simply source these materials from other suppliers because other suppliers do not have processing capacity at the required scale. American companies cannot simply build their own processing facilities because the capital requirements are enormous, the permitting timeline is measured in years, and the technical expertise resides in Canada. This creates a situation where American industrial policy depends on Canadian supply chain decisions. If Canadian facilities prioritize domestic manufacturing or Asian export markets, American manufacturers face shortages regardless of what American politicians promise about reshoring production or rebuilding domestic industry. The leverage is structural, not rhetorical. Let me be specific about what this looked like in practice during the most recent round of trade negotiations. American officials arrived expecting to discuss terms for continued Canadian resource exports. Canadian officials arrived with a list of American concessions required in exchange for guaranteed access to processing capacity. Not raw materials, processing capacity. The difference is fundamental. If the discussion was about raw materials, American officials could threaten to source from alternative suppliers or develop domestic alternatives. If the discussion is about processing capacity that took 20 years to build and cannot be replicated quickly, American officials cannot threaten anything credible. They can only negotiate for access on terms that Canadian officials are willing to accept. The specific concessions that Canada extracted from these negotiations have not been publicly disclosed in full detail, but the general categories are known. American tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel were permanently eliminated. American content requirements for electric vehicles were modified to classify Canadian processing as equivalent to domestic American processing. American defense procurement regulations were amended to treat Canadian critical mineral suppliers as part of the American defense industrial base. These are not minor trade adjustments. These are structural changes to American industrial policy that recognize Canadian processing infrastructure as essential to American economic security. Once these changes are formalized in treaty language and implemented in procurement regulations, reversing them becomes extraordinarily difficult because doing so would immediately disrupt American supply chains. This is how dependency becomes locked in, not through a single dramatic decision, but through accumulated commitments that make their relationship increasingly difficult to exit. Every American factory that designs production around Canadian material supplies creates another constituency that opposes any policy that might disrupt Canadian access. Every Pentagon weapons system that incorporates Canadian processed materials creates a national security argument against antagonizing Canadian suppliers. The genius of the Canadian approach is that it never demanded anything explicitly. Canadian officials never threatened to cut off supplies or restrict access. They simply built infrastructure, developed technical expertise, and made that infrastructure available to American manufacturers on terms that seemed reasonable at the time. Only later, after American companies had committed to Canadian supply chains and designed Canadian materials into their products, did the full extent of the dependency become clear. This is strategic patience, operating at a level that most contemporary political systems cannot achieve. The infrastructure investments that created this advantage were initiated in the early 2000s, long before electric vehicles were mainstream, long before renewable energy was cost competitive, long before critical minerals were considered strategically essential. Canadian policymakers were positioning Canada for a transition that they understood was inevitable, even if the timeline was uncertain. Compare this to American approaches to strategic planning, which tend to operate on 2-year electoral cycles and 4-year presidential terms. American policy lurches from crisis response to crisis response without the institutional capacity for patient long-term positioning. By the time American officials recognized that critical minerals represented a strategic vulnerability, Canada had already built the infrastructure that would take the United States 15 to 20 years to replicate domestically. The Chinese approach is different but faces its own limitations. China spent the past 30 years building processing capacity for critical minerals. But Chinese leverage is constrained by geography and politics in ways that Canadian leverage is not. Chinese processing facilities are located thousands of kilometers from end users, connected to global markets through shipping routes that could be disrupted. Chinese government control over supply chains creates political risk that manufacturers must factor into sourcing decisions. Canadian facilities are located in Canada, connected to American and European markets by road and rail infrastructure that cannot be easily disrupted. Canadian democratic governance provides supply chain security that authoritarian alternatives cannot match. When manufacturers choose between sourcing materials from Chinese processors or Canadian processors, the Canadian option provides geographic proximity, political stability, and alliance reliability. This is why Canada's position is more durable than China's critical mineral leverage. China built processing monopolies that could be broken if customer nations were willing to accept disruption and invest in alternatives. Canada built processing infrastructure that is genuinely more efficient and more strategically advantageous than alternatives. Let me give you a specific example. An American battery manufacturer needs battery-grade lithium hydroxide. The Chinese option offers lower prices but requires shipping across the Pacific and creates vulnerability to trade disputes. The Canadian option offers stable pricing, overland delivery, and political support from both American and Canadian officials. The manufacturer chooses the Canadian option not because they are forced to, but because it is genuinely superior when all factors are considered. Now I need to address the question that should be forming in your mind. If Canada has built this kind of structural advantage, why is this not widely recognized or discussed in analyses of global power dynamics? Why do conventional assessments of national power still focus on military capabilities and GDP figures while largely ignoring control over essential industrial inputs? The answer is that power transitions are rarely recognized in real time. Historical accounts written decades later identify specific dates or events as turning points, but people living through those transitions usually do not recognize their significance until much later. The specific arrangements that shift leverage from one nation to another are often technical, boring, and invisible to populations focused on more dramatic developments. Consider the transition in global financial power from Britain to the United States during the early 20th century. At the time, this transition was obscured by dramatic events like World War I and the Great Depression. Only in retrospect did it become clear that the fundamental shift occurred through boring mechanisms like gold reserves and currency agreements that gradually made the dollar, rather than the pound, the foundation of international finance. The transition in critical mineral control from dispersed global sources to concentrated Canadian processing is following a similar pattern. The infrastructure investments are boring. The processing facilities are located in remote regions that generate minimal media coverage. The supply agreements are commercially confidential and negotiated outside public view. The technical expertise being developed resides in labs and engineering departments that operate far from political attention. But the accumulated effect of these boring developments is a fundamental shift in leverage that will become obvious only when someone tries to challenge it and discovers they cannot. This is how structural power operates. It builds quietly through technical competence and patient investment until the moment when everyone suddenly realizes the existing arrangements cannot be easily changed. We are approaching that moment of recognition now. The evidence is visible in corporate behavior and government policy, even if public discourse has not yet caught up. American defense contractors are quietly restructuring supply chains to ensure Canadian material access. European automotive manufacturers are establishing processing partnerships in Canada to secure battery supply chains. Asian electronics companies are signing long-term agreements with Canadian suppliers. These are not friendly gestures or partnership opportunities. These are acknowledgments of dependency. Companies do not restructure supply chains and sign long-term agreements unless they recognize they have no better alternatives. Governments do not modify industrial policy and procurement regulations unless they acknowledge they cannot achieve strategic objectives without cooperation from foreign suppliers. Let me give you the clearest possible example of what this means for global power dynamics. The United States has structured its defense industrial base around domestic production of weapon systems as a matter of national security policy. American fighter jets are built in American factories, using American technology. This independence from foreign suppliers is considered essential to maintaining military superiority. But American fighter jets cannot be built without materials that Canada processes: the titanium alloys in airframes, the rare earth elements in electronics, the specialty steels in engines. Every one of these material categories depends on inputs that flow through Canadian supply chains. If those supply chains were disrupted, American defense contractors could not manufacture the weapon systems that the Pentagon requires. This creates a situation that contradicts fundamental assumptions about how military power operates. The United States possesses the most powerful military in human history, but that military cannot be sustained without access to materials processed in Canada. The weapons that provide American military superiority cannot be manufactured if Canadian processing capacity is redirected to other customers. This is not a theoretical vulnerability. This is a practical constraint that American defense planners must account for in every strategic assessment. If a serious conflict emerged, American defense production would depend on maintaining Canadian supply chain access throughout. If Canadian facilities were damaged, or if Canadian policymakers decided to restrict military-related exports, American weapons production would face immediate constraints. The implications are profound for anyone who thinks about national security through traditional frameworks of military power and strategic autonomy. The United States has effectively outsourced a critical component of national defense capability to a foreign country. That foreign country is a close ally with every reason to maintain cooperation. But allies have interests that diverge. Allies have domestic political pressures that may not align with American priorities. Allies have the capacity to use leverage that comes from controlling essential inputs. Canada has never indicated any intention to weaponize critical mineral supplies or disrupt American defense production, but the capacity to do so exists, and that capacity represents a form of power that did not exist 20 years ago. American defense planners who once assumed that Canadian cooperation could be taken for granted now understand that Canadian cooperation must be actively maintained through policies that respect Canadian interests. This is what dependency looks like from the perspective of the dependent party. Not a hostile relationship, but a recognition that things once considered automatic now require negotiation. Things once considered secure now require careful management. Canada has achieved strategic autonomy in a way that few countries have managed. For most of Canadian history, the country was constrained by American preferences. This framework is dissolving. Canadian control over critical processing infrastructure means that, in specific domains, the United States depends on Canada more than Canada depends on the United States. The European Union is experiencing a similar recalibration. If Canadian officials prioritized Asian export markets, European factories would face material shortages. European negotiators would need to offer policy concessions to maintain Canadian cooperation. Now I want to examine why the situation is stable rather than temporary. Some observers might assume that other countries will invest in competing infrastructure within a decade. Critical mineral processing does not follow this pattern for reasons that are technical, economic, and geopolitical. The technical challenge is that building processing facilities requires specialized expertise that is not widely distributed. Canada has spent 20 years developing this expertise. Competitor countries face a knowledge deficit that cannot be overcome quickly. The economic challenge is that processing facilities require enormous capital investment with long payback periods. A lithium processing facility costs multiple billions of dollars and takes 5 to 7 years to build. Investors are reluctant to compete when Canadian operations have advantages in efficiency and established customer relationships. The geopolitical challenge is that building facilities requires stable governance and environmental permitting. Canada offers all the institutional advantages that make large industrial projects succeed: transparent permitting, stable regulations, reliable contract enforcement. The United States has announced major initiatives to build domestic processing capacity. Yet, as of early 2026, the number of American facilities that have moved from planning to operation remains limited. Meanwhile, Canadian facilities continue expanding. This is what an appreciating advantage looks like. Not a temporary monopoly, but a structural advantage that reinforces itself. Canada did not achieve this position through behavior that violated international norms. Canada simply invested in infrastructure, developed expertise, and made processing capacity available at market prices. The fact that this conventional development strategy has produced such substantial leverage is a remarkable historical outcome. This pattern has precedents. The Netherlands in the 17th century achieved influence through control over shipping. Britain in the 19th century used control over shipping routes and coal supplies. The United States in the 20th century leveraged oil markets and financial systems. Canada in the 21st century is following a similar pattern through control over materials that enable advanced technology. This is sophisticated power, the kind of influence that lasts because it is based on providing value rather than imposing costs. Countries that depend on Canadian processing do not resent the dependency in the same way they might resent military occupation. The fact that this valuable service also creates dependency is almost incidental. This willing dependency is more stable than coerced dependency. Canada has positioned itself as the essential partner for any country that wants to participate in technological transitions. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, advanced electronics. Every one of these domains requires materials that flow through Canadian processing infrastructure. This is not dramatic power. This is not the kind of influence that generates headlines. But it is durable power that compounds over time as dependency deepens and alternatives remain limited. 20 years from now, historians may identify Canadian control over critical mineral processing as one of the most significant but least understood power transitions of the era. The transition happened quietly through boring mechanisms: infrastructure investments, technical training programs, permitting reforms. None of these developments seemed particularly significant at the time. Accumulated over 20 years, they created a position of strength that more powerful countries cannot easily challenge. This is how power moves when it is not looking for attention. This is how leverage builds when it is focused on solving technical problems rather than making political statements. And this is why most people still do not understand that Canada owns the one thing every superpower needs. The thing is not dramatic enough to generate headlines. The ownership is not explicit enough to be obvious. The need is not immediate enough to force recognition. Until the day when someone tries to proceed without Canadian cooperation and discovers they cannot. That day will eventually arrive. The recognition will eventually occur. The dependency will eventually be acknowledged openly rather than managed quietly. By then, the arrangements will be too deeply embedded to easily change. By then, Canadian leverage will be accepted as a permanent feature of the international system. History does not announce these transitions. History simply records them after they have already become irreversible.